We're not talking about doing local optimization. We're talking about doing large-scale change. We're not talking about creating agile projects or agile teams. What we're doing is creating agile organizations. And whether that be transforming existing organizations or creating models for new organizations that are going to come down the pike over the next 10, 15, 20 years, like what do we want to be educating our new leaders on? What old things do we want to deconstruct and pull into a new paradigm? What are the current beliefs that need to change so that we can do this really well? So hey everybody, how are you guys doing? So we're gonna talk a little bit today about some things that I've been noodling on for a while. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to enlist your help and your support and help me figure this out a little bit. So as you guys know, Leading Agile, we are exclusively in the change management business. Typically, we're doing agile transformation and all the change management that's associated with that. And one of the ways over the last 12, 13 years that we've been around, and really before that when, I was just doing social media stuff on the blog and Twitter and things like that. But, a big part of, what we try to do is we try to educate people on how to think about change, how to think about agile transformation. Because if you call us up and you say something like, hey, we want some training, it's like, okay, like what do you want to be trained on? What do you believe? What's your environment like, right? There's a bunch of different things, right? And so if you show up and like you say, hey, I want to adopt Agile, but you're not familiar with teaming strategies or agile governance strategies or such, right? There's just a lot of stuff to unwind. And so like what we try to do is we try to do a lot of videos like this to enlist people and to get people thinking around things the right way. And the people that see things our way and have a need for our services will typically pick up the phone and call. And so I started thinking about this week all of the different things that really go in to helping somebody fundamentally see how to transform. So I started taking some notes. So I have some notes over here on my page. And so I'm going to kind of do a survey of, kind of my top of mind stuff throughout the week. And then the idea is I've got my marketing team on the call with me right now. You actually can't see them, but they're listening and they're going to take this and they're going to turn it in and edit it and all that kind of stuff. And then what we're going to do is we're going to turn it into a series of more micro topics that we go. But today is kind of like a survey. And what I'd really love for you guys to do is as you're listening to this, to start to think about for me, am I missing anything? Like what other barriers do you see? What other kind of conceptual gaps? And so the first thing I want to talk about a little bit is the idea of what does it actually mean to be successful with Agile? And on the one extreme, you have things like, the actual business results you're going for, whether it be predictability. We talk about predictability, quality, putting things in market fast so you can charge for them. Particularly quality return on investment, cost savings. Are we optimizing the throughput of the organization? Are we doing it in a cost efficient way? Do we have the right people in the right seats? Innovation, are we able to get feedback from customers and invent products that they want to use? Product fit, are we generating the right kinds of feedback so we make sure we're building the right products, whether that be innovative or more in a structured way? But then And so those tend to be like the business benefits of it, right? And the other side of that coin, and this is something that we see a lot, it's like success for Agile tends to be like, are we doing the practices effectively? And there's this assumption that says something to the effect of like, if we're doing the practices effectively, theoretically, we should be getting the business results from it. But as I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen, there's a lot of people running around doing Scrum or Safe or whatever, and they're not actually achieving the goals of agility. And what's hard, and I don't want to go too deep into this one, but what's really difficult about that is that it's like there's impediments in the organization that people can't fundamentally change. And so because they can't change the things that are getting in the way of agility, they start defining success in an agile transformation as, are you doing the agile things? right? And so on the one extreme, it's very much like a cargo cult kind of, if we do these things, it will happen, versus all the way on the other side of measurable benefits, business benefits. And so, one of the first things we try to help people overcome or get really clear on is, what does success look like? Why are you doing this? And what does success look like? The second thing that is interesting, and I gave a nod to this in a talk a couple of weeks ago coming out of the Agile event that I spoke at. And the idea is like, what is possible to change in the organization? And there's a lot of folks that are adopting Agile that are in organizations that are really, really difficult to change. And, we get into clients like that, and our consultants get faced with these things all the time, where you live in this kind of this weird dichotomy of, I know these things must be true to be successful, but the organization doesn't seem to want to change them. And so to some degree, you have to cast a vision for what is possible to change. Cast a vision, but you also have to sometimes get people to suspend disbelief in terms of what's possible. Because as we know, right, Agile requires a certain kind of operating model to really be functional, right, at scale and to achieve the goals, right? So the challenge that we have is we have to get people to suspend disbelief that certain things that are hard to change are actually not impossible to change, right? And that there's a path forward and that there's a way to engage into doing this. So, first point is, why are we doing this? Like, why does it matter? What does success look like? And then what are the things that we're willing to tackle in the organization to create the conditions to be able to achieve those goals, right? So those are the first two things I listed. The second thing that I was thinking through was stuff that we've done talks here over the last couple of years, what I call like the physics of transformation. And there's certain really interesting rules, right? Like we have to be able to bring capacity and demand into balance. And so from an Agile perspective, like if I know the size of my backlog and I know the velocity of the team, I have 100 points in my backlog, the velocity of the team is 20, we're not going to pull more than 20 points into a sprint, and we know it's going to take about 5 sprints if we want to get through that entire backlog, with some negotiation and some variation and everything. But like this idea that we have to figure out how to bring capacity and demand into balance, because most of the organizations we go into are like 10 times overloaded, right? It's not even about cost savings. It's like trying to figure out value density and what is the path through the backlog that's going to deliver the most value within the time and cost constraints, right? So this idea of capacity and demand. One of the things I think about a lot is the idea of organizing around value. A lot of times when organizations are early stage adoption of Agile, they think about organizing around projects, and projects are indeed valuable, but they're also transient, and they encourage, kind of a cost accounting versus a throughput accounting model. And so, this idea of, organizing around the persistent value objects in the organization, right? So we have the idea of, organizing around value streams, or organizing around feature sets or business capabilities, something like that. And so, but there's a conceptual thing you have to overcome, because there's a lot of people in the world that believe that you organize around activity. You put people in functional silos. You assign them to the work as needed based upon their skill set. So if you can't overcome that, it's really hard to make a case for Agile teams. The last thing that I kind of jotted down in this is really kind of like a class of things that come, around the idea of theory of constraints. And so we optimize for the flow of value. We optimize for limiting work in process. We optimize for getting things finished before we get things started. We understand where the constraints are in the system. We move resources into the constrained objects so that we can increase the flow through the system. That's where you get into the conversations often about cost accounting versus throughput accounting and those kinds of things. And so if you've grown up in a traditional mindset, you've grown up in a traditional project management model, very often those folks are centered around the idea of functional silos, local optimization, focusing on cost accounting versus throughput accounting, where Agilists tend to be more like organize around value, sub-optimize the idea of cost for the elevation of throughput, making sure value streams are encapsulated, things like that. The idea of encapsulation versus orchestration. So we have to overcome the idea that when you organize around value, you want to do it in a way that minimizes dependencies. Because when you have dependencies in place, you either have to break dependencies or you have to manage them. A lot of times, agilists in the presence of dependencies want those dependencies self-organized away. So it's like the traditionalists want to hyper-manage dependencies. A lot of agilists want to ignore dependencies and believe the team will self-organize them. And often there's like a middle ground, right? But you got to make the case for that middle ground a little bit, right? So there's like some underlying thinking tools that are involved that we have to get people to be able to see. Probably the third category of stuff, and this is what I find interesting about kind of the industrialized agile frameworks at this point. So you think SAFe, large scale Scrum, maybe, although I don't know that fits in that category. Scrum as a model, XP as a model, things like that, right? The idea that it's the prescription of the methodology that matters. We talk in Leading Agile a lot about the idea of reference architecture versus reference implementation. And what I say about SAFe often is that SAFe is a very valid, it's based upon a very valid reference architecture. Scrum teams at the bottom, some sort of orchestration mechanism at the product middle tier, some sort of orchestration mechanism up at the portfolio tier, some linkage to investment tier, investment strategy, focusing on the flow of value at each level, understanding lean principles. And so fundamentally under its core, like I don't have any issue with SAFe. I think SAFe's fine. There's things that we often will do differently or in addition to or subtract from a SAFe type model. But point being is that almost all scaled methodologies, probably all scaled methodologies are built around some sort of fundamental reference architecture that we believe is inarguable. Then on the other side of that, you have this idea of reference implementation. And that's where I think SAFe gets a little wonky sometimes, is that it's a specific reference implementation on top of a very valid reference architecture. And so what happens, and it happens always, it happens with the PMBOK, it happened with RUP, it happens with SAFe, it happens with Scrum, it happens with everything, right? Is we take the implementation details and we say that it's the details, right? The roles, the ceremonies, the artifacts, the cadences, all those different things that we model as implementation details, we take that as the thing. And then we over-index on having the roles, having the titles, having the ceremonies, having the artifacts, right? All those kinds of different things. And so you take something that's very valid, like SAFe, and then you pick up the reference implementation as described in the SAFe materials and in SAFe training. And, the people that invent these methodologies, they will acknowledge that they're designed to be tailored. But in practice, very often, they don't actually get tailored, right? They get implemented as a whole because people want to believe it's the implementation details or the roles or the ceremonies or what have you, and not the underlying reference architectural patterns, right? So you have to help people see. It's this weird non-dualistic way of thinking about things. It's like the patterns are immutable, the implementation details are helpful. And then we have to ask ourselves what implementation details are going to help us best support the reference architecture patterns that are actually the secret sauce. So like to think about that, from a really simplistic perspective is you take something like Scrum. So one of the things that I do from a reference architecture perspective is I talk about the three things. So what is the fundamental pattern of Scrum? The fundamental pattern of Scrum is that you have a dedicated team organized around value, with few, if any, dependencies. You have a well-defined backlog, and you're able to produce a working tested increment at the end of every sprint, right? To me, like if you have those three things in place, that's the only thing you need to be able to do Scrum well. Now, you can further specify that and you say, okay, the product owner is the one that creates the backlog and the team is made up of these roles and not these other roles. And, this is what it means to get to a definition of done. And we can be really dogmatic about, is there a Scrum Master? Is there a product owner? Is there, a burn down chart? Are we using sticky notes on the wall? Are we doing story point estimating? Are we using planning poker? Are we doing reviews? Are we doing retrospectives? What kind of reviews and retrospectives are we doing and how are we doing them? Those are all details. right? And sometimes they're helpful details and sometimes they're not. And so like, I'm not interested in the prescription of Scrum that says you have to have a product owner. It's helpful if you have a product owner as Scrum describes it, but if you don't, like putting a business analyst in front of a backlog, someone who doesn't have the background, understanding, authority to make decisions, like that's not helpful. Putting a Scrum Master on that team that can't actually go out and remove the organizational impediments that are required often isn't helpful, but that's what we're doing in practice. Right? So helping people understand the difference between reference architecture and reference implementation. Is there a different implementation that can help us more effectively achieve our goals when we deeply understand the patterns, the principles of reference architectures that are involved? Right? So you got to get people through that kind of a hang up. Which really kind of leads us to something else that I talk about quite often is the idea of systems first. Systems, practices, then culture. It's like if I can get the teaming strategies right, I can get the governance strategies right, I can get the measurements right, so I call systems, then, and I can start to build a solid system of delivery on top of those patterns, right? Then I've created the conditions for the Agile practices to come in, right? So I can pick out elements of Scrum and Kanban and SAFe and LESS and things like that, right? XP. And then I enable it with really solid practices, and then culture can emerge over time. But common beliefs that are out there are that it's a culture problem first. And if we don't change the culture, Agile will never take hold. There's some truth to that, right? But similarly, I teach you how to do practices, and you start doing the Agile practices, and then that's going to somehow solve all the problems. But the education, the point of education is that what makes Agile unique and really different from like a PMBOK style of project management is that PMBOK in general project management doesn't specify org design. Everything about Agile implies org design. So if we don't get the systems congruent, we don't get the operating model in place with the practices of the methodology, then we have very little chance of the culture emerging around that, right? So people need to understand that, because the competing beliefs are, if I can get everybody to change their mind, then we're going to be fine and Agile is going to take hold. That's not true across the board. I've worked with leadership teams at this point that were all in on Agile. And the classic example I use is, imagine if you have teams of, like, say, everybody has just this spirit of agility, wants to inspect and adapt, wants to respond to market. But I'm sitting on top of a 50-year-old COBOL mainframe that is very poorly architected, takes months to deploy something, prone to breaking, right? All those kinds of things. It's like, I can have the best attitude all day long, but if my underlying technical architecture doesn't support my mindset of agility, I am going to fail. If I don't have an organizational design, if I don't have a governance framework, if I don't have measurement that is consistent with Agile, no matter what my attitude, it's going to fail. Now, it feels like it's an attitude problem because it's like there's resistance, there's cognitive dissonance, there's things to overcome. If we could just get people to change their mindset, we would be fine. Well, mindset's important, right? But we have to congruent operating model, solid practices, get people to change hearts and minds over time. So, huge point of education that I believe has to happen in order to really get people to wrap their head around this game of Agile transformation. There's another thing that I've been thinking about a lot as we work with larger and larger clients and we start to deal with really issues of scale. And it's a classic, like, blind man and the elephant problem. And I think you guys are probably mostly familiar. I mean, I know I got introduced to this parable through the Agile community probably 15 years ago at this point. But the idea of the blind man and the elephant, you have these, three blind men that are standing next to an elephant, and one's touching its ear, one touching its tail, one touching its leg, and the one touching its ear says an elephant's like a palm tree, right? It has fronds and leaves and things like that. And the one touching the tail says, no, it's more like a snake, where you have, because it's long and thin and flicks around and stuff. And the one touching the leg is like, no, it's like a tree. And they get in fights because they're all looking at the same thing from very different points of view. And as we've unpacked this, it's like we get involved in leading Agile. It's not just in team level transformation, but in enterprise level transformation, whole IT organization transformations. We get involved in, helping people change their financial governance strategies, KPIs, OKRs, things like that. And in doing so, right, DevOps transformation, right, digital transformation, business transformation, business agility, right, all these buzzwords, right, they're all aspects of the same thing at the end of the day, right? What people are trying to figure out how to do is to use technology, to leverage technology to generate better business outcomes. And so some of it is like, I think there's almost, and I should probably try to write an article on this or something, but it's like, there's almost like a unified theory that is starting to emerge that really takes, like, you could take things like, we talk about structure, practices, and culture kind of in the Agile world. You can tie that to the whole OKR movement. You can tie it to a digital transformation story. You can tie it to a DevOps transformation story. One of the fascinating things we're seeing right now, a huge opportunity in market around DevOps. And it's like you could almost ask yourself the question, why DevOps fails? I'm not a deep DevOps expert. I've got a lot of really deep DevOps experts on my team. But what's kind of funny is that DevOps is failing for the same reason everything else is failing. It's like we treat it like it's a tool problem, or we treat it like it's a practices problem, or we treat it like it's a mindset problem. And almost always it's an organizational structure problem, it's a governance, it's a work intake problem, it's a culture problem, it's an adoption problem, it's an alignment problem, it's an integrating it with the whole problem. And so when we take like a thread like DevOps, highly unlikely, if we're not thinking about it from a systems perspective, that we're going to get a lot of stuff wrong. And so you start to, when you think through this blind man and the elephant lens, it's like we're all blind men and we're looking at our particular piece of it and failing to kind of respect that the idea of organizational design, governance, practices, metrics, culture, right, all these things, it's all an integrated whole, and it has to tie together because it's one fundamental company. So investment strategy, OKRs, KPIs, audit controls, financial compliance, governance, all that stuff, product management strategy, requirements decomposition, traceability, agile delivery and execution, DevOps, enterprise architecture. All of those things are all part of the same story. And oftentimes we talk about it like they're distinct things that happen in a company. But again, blind man and the elephant problem, they're all pieces of the same thing, right? Like the last little bit that I want to hit on, again, this is just kind of a top of mind exploration for me as I was contemplating what I want to talk with you guys about this week, is, what the difference between what we call like a system of delivery, a system of transformation. We also talk about a system of engagement versus a system of continuous improvement. And there's really, when somebody calls us, there's really 4 questions that they're really trying to sort through. It's like, what does it look like? What does the operating model look like when Agile is done? Like, how will we operate differently? I had a client in the early days of leading Agile go, what will be the evidence that you were here after you've gone? It's something like that. That's a paraphrase of it. So like, what will my organization look like when we're done? That's a question that people want to know the answer to. And so basically saying, well, it's just going to emerge and we're going to figure it out as we go is usually not a satisfying answer. There has to be a starting place. So what does the end state operating model look like? Second question is how are we going to get there? What is the transformation strategy? How are we going to introduce these ideas? How are we going to break up the organization? What are we going to form teams around? How are we going to do that? What are we going to do with resource disparities across the organization? How are we going to measure progress on the transformation? How are we going to know what done looks like? How are we going to know we've actually improved? How are we going to know that we've actually delivered against the goals of the transformation? So you have the end state model, but then you also have the transformation strategy. Call that system of transformation, right? So when you hear me talk about expeditions and base camps and outcomes-based plans and activity guides and leading and lagging indicators of the transformation, what we're really talking about is how do you orchestrate the transformation? But more generally, like, what is the change management around the transformation? look like, right? How are we keeping everybody informed? How are we making sure the organization knows what to expect, what the impacts are going to be, right? All those kinds of things. So there's stuff that has to overcome there. The third piece we call system of engagement, which is a couple of different things, right? A lot of times for us as a consultancy, it's really about like how we structure contracts and how we think about deliverables and how we think about milestones. But it's also a lot about how our consultants collaborate with each other. How are they co-conspiring and collaborating with the client? How are we demonstrating economic value for the dollars that they're spending with us? Maybe most importantly is how are we reducing cognitive dissonance and creating shared understanding through the course of the transformation. So how am I going to get my stakeholders enlisted in being able to do this? And then the last piece is, okay, once we've transformed, is that a one-time event or is that something that happens over time? Well, I think in practicality, the transformation has a beginning and an end. But an agile organization is supposed to be continually adapting to market changes and new opportunities, right? And in one way that manifests in terms of small batches and backlog items and epics and features and user stories moving through queues. But that's a little bit like the work in the system, right? But the challenge is there's like an element of stuff that's on the system, like how do teaming strategies change over time? When we need to enter new markets, how do we redeploy resources, people, teams, things like that into new opportunities, right? How does the organization dynamically adjust? We call that system of continuous improvement. How do we continuously reevaluate the business architecture? How do we align business architecture to strategy in an ongoing way? Simple things like when new people come in, how do we orient them to our system and how we work? How do we educate them? How do we coach them? How do we support them? How do we find people that are capable? Like these things are all what we call system of continuous improvement. And the education, the point of education is that, you think about it at one extreme. If I see Agile as is its own means to an end, like the goal of adopting Agile is that we're doing Scrum. And so in that world, I say, okay, well, I'm going to train everybody on how to do Scrum. And if everybody doing Scrum is the measure of success, well, okay, fine, right? Then we have a pretty simple worldview. But in practice, right, our experience, and I bet you your experience is that really doesn't work. Right? It doesn't work at scale. It works for a team. It works for a small work group, right? No argument in the small. But in the large, right, we have to have a greater conceptualization of all the different little pieces that have to be hooked into. And so many people, it's like what they want is they want an easy button. It's like, hey, we want to do Agile. I'm excited about Agile. Can I get some training to do Agile? And that's good, right? It's a great introductory step. A lot of our clients start off, or not a lot of our clients, but a lot of our clients have started off in the past with kind of a training first approach. They've gotten everybody doing the practices and just got really limited results. So then they start looking at scaled methodologies and they start trying to transform, but they don't really fully understand the systems, practices, culture interrelationship, right? So they introduce scaled methodologies and that kind of works a little bit. Or maybe they start trying to figure out how to do teams and agile structures and agile governance, but it just everything doesn't click into place. And so this idea that we can separate the definition of the operating model, the initial idealized end state, with a separate strategy for how we're actually going to move the organization around. And then a third piece that is how are we going to create shared cognition across the organization, do all the change management, and then how are we going to stay there and make sure that we have a continuously adaptive organization over time. Right, so that was my top of mind list as I was sitting down thinking about what I wanted to say to you guys. So what I'm hoping that you might do for me, and I'd love for you to respond in the comments, whether you're seeing this on YouTube or LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever. And my marketing team is going to be like paying attention, and they'll alert me and I'll engage if appropriate or would deal with it in a subsequent video. But I'd love to hear from you the kinds of what I would call like conceptual things that need to overcome. What are the current beliefs that need to be overcome? What are the current beliefs that need to change so that we can do this really well? I'd really love your thoughts on what you've experienced. I'd love to compare notes, see what you guys are thinking, and if you'd be so kind, help us advance this message, because I think we're on to something, right? I think there's a way of thinking about this that enables us to deconstruct existing worldviews and to build new ones. I think a lot about, and this is a total aside, right? But I think a lot about, because I'm a University of Florida guy. And so pre-COVID, I used to spend a lot of time down there talking to the entrepreneur and innovation groups and leadership, engineering leadership, industrial and systems engineers, that kind of a thing. And I've thought a lot about, like, what would you, if you're going to build a curriculum to do large-scale transformation and you were going to mint PhDs in Agile transformation strategy, like what are the things that you would want them to know? What are the things that you would want them to believe? And I think there's a huge part of this that is industrial and systems engineering oriented. I think there's a bunch of organizational design, organizational psychology. I think there's a lot of business. I think there's a lot of change management. I think we would pull in a lot of large-scale software architecture, and then tons of industry knowledge, like DevOps and project management and all these different things. And so we have a big task ahead of us, right? It's like we have to convince people, like we're not talking about doing local optimization. We're talking about doing large-scale change. We're not talking about creating Agile projects or Agile teams. What we're doing is creating Agile organizations. And whether that be transforming existing organizations or creating models for new organizations that are going to come down the pike over the next 10, 15, 20 years, like what do we want to be educating our new leaders on? What old things do we want to deconstruct and pull into a new paradigm? And so that's what I want to explore with you guys. So anything you could offer would help, and I would love to engage in conversation on it. So thanks for your time, and I'll look forward to talking with you guys next time. Have a great day. See you.